Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jason, and I am here with another great guest for you. I am speaking with the one and only Tony White. He is a tremendous ultra runner, marathoner. He coaches. He is a kind of does it all, and so I really appreciate you joining me today, Tony. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to be here.
So I guess, just let's get started a little bit before we get into all these awesome things that you've done with your running here. Where are you from? Are you from Tennessee or outside the state? Where you hail from?
Actually grew up in Eastern Kentucky and picked up running when I was about 16 or 17 years old, mainly because some of the guys on the cross country team told me we were going to get to take a trip to the beach. And we ended up getting a different coach and did not get to take that trip. But in that 3 months, I went from like a 24-minute 5K guy down to around like 18 minutes or so. So like seeing that much improvement in a short amount of time kind of got me hooked to running at that point. So, and then from there, went to school at UK. So grew up in Kentucky, stayed there for a bit, and then ended up in Nashville about 10 years ago.
Cool. So obviously a huge Wildcats fan, big basketball fan, I take it.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and their football team isn't too bad now. I remember growing up, their football team wasn't too hot, but now it's like it seems like they're a lot better than they used to be. I guess overall, right?
It's a lot of fun to follow both teams. Yeah. And like in recent years, the basketball team hasn't been as good as we wanted, but the football team has been much better than, like you said, like when I was there, I think we made our first bowl in like, I don't know, 10 or 12 years back when I was in school, but it's fun to see them make it, 4 or 5, 6 straight seasons of going to a bowl game. So
Yeah, that's always good when your home school does well. So I guess, looking at it, you already kind of alluded to it a little bit. You did some running in high school. Did you stay with it through college, or what did that look like for you? Did you evolve like from a social aspect and do what most people do when they just kind of went from the 5K, the 10K, the half marathon, or did you travel a different avenue?
So when I was a freshman at University of Kentucky, I walked onto the team, and the coach was nice enough to let me participate for a semester before he politely sat me down. It's like, hey, we've got quite a few guys that are pretty fast. Like, you might look into something else. So I immediately signed up for a marathon, like literally like within a week of getting cut from the team. And then about 2 weeks after that, I had immediately like ramped my miles up and was trying to run it all fast and got hurt. I ended up with like shin splints or something. But so basically like took a bunch of time off, but picked up swimming and cycling in the process, and then got into triathlons from there. So actually I competed in my first triathlon probably when I was a sophomore at University of Kentucky, and raced triathlons for on and off for 10 years or so. I actually did it a couple years professionally, so that's kind of my background in sport before I eventually jumped onto, was kind of burnt out, found my first trail race, and then kind of rediscovered my love for endurance sports. So
Yeah, it's funny because you hit on the triathlon background, because I was going to ask you about that, because I knew that you had a triathlon background. Um, I guess you said you had some success at it, and you stayed with it for a bit. What was it that ultimately pulled you out of it?
probably just being burnt out. It almost like, so when I first got into it, triathlon was kind of like ultra running is now, where like there were a bunch of local events that like you didn't necessarily have to worry about the event itself having insurance or anything like that. It was just, you just kind of show up, you kind of know you're going to swim in this around these boats at this mom and pop marina. The water's muddy, you're going to ride these back roads, and then run this 5K on this grass course or whatever it is. But all these like at home small triathlons kind of like that hooked me into the sport. And then I got into bigger races, found some success. I did qualify to race professionally, and like being a professional in the sport, like you got to it's not like a running race where like you have to be designated as a professional or not. It basically just makes you you're allowed to compete for prize money.
Mm-hmm.
And so once I got into that, like I enjoyed it the first probably 2 or 3 years. Just I was consistently getting faster and was racing against like I got to race against Chris McCormick, Greg Alexander, a lot of the big names in the sport of triathlon. And eventually, like there was one year I almost turned it more into a business and it felt like more of a job. So I also ended up with plantar fasciitis really bad. So having an injury and then also coming at it from the approach of just a business standpoint, like, oh, I've got to make money, I've got to do this. I kind of lost the love for it. So I ended up taking 2 years off of professional racing. I still was training a little bit, just kind of staying fit here and there. But it was about the time we moved to Nashville. So I worked for AT&T for a bit, worked for US Bank for a bit, and just wasn't having fun. And then eventually kind of came back into it, but I wasn't at the same level that I was at when I left the sport. And eventually,
Now,
like my wife and I sat down and we talked about growing our family and all that stuff.
so was it as expensive back then as it is now to do?
What helped being a professional is I was on a pro team. So like I would get my bike would be at a steep discount. So I still had to pay for it, but it was like it wasn't an $8,000 bike. I was only had to pay $1,000 for it, or whatever it may be. Or so not as expensive, but like there were ways that like being a professional had it had its benefits in that it wasn't as expensive. A lot of the races I could get in for free. I had to get to those races. So travel was still, a lot. I raced a lot around Nashville, so I didn't have to pay for a ton of flights or anything. But I definitely never owned like a $10,000 or $12,000 bicycle. Like some of the stuff that I see today, like I joke that I'll never be able to race in triathlon again because I would have to reinvest all this money back into the sport.
I mean, that's crazy. I mean, that's like the price of like a car. Well, I mean, like an old car, like an old used car, but still, I mean, I can't even fathom paying $3,000 for a bike or two
Right.
thousand dollars for a bike. And I was hearing about these guys dropping 10, 12 grand for a bike. I mean, that's just crazy. And I was wondering about like, you know, what the sustainability is being from a financial standpoint. And you brought up a good point that a lot of it is deep discounted if you're like a pro or an elite or whatever. But like for just the average person who wants to compete well, I heard that you still have to have a pretty decent bike to even like compete. And so like I was just curious like what that sustainability is, but I think you pretty much like just explained it out extremely well. So I guess coming out of triathlons, when did you decide to re-up the running game? Was it just straight out of the gate from triathlons, or were you still dabbling in some of the running stuff then, or what was that?
So I had on and off had a little bit of an injury. It was still like plantar fascia / Achilles injury. And so my daughter was born in the summer of 2016, dealing a little, like I was still running, doing a little bit of cycling after she was born. So like right before she was born, that was my last official triathlon. I had competed in the Music City Triathlon for 4 years in a row and won 3 of the last 4 going into that year. And I joked with my wife. I was like, hey, like you stay close to the transition area. She was 39 weeks pregnant. I was like, if I come out of the swim and you wave me down, then I'm stopping the race. We're going straight to the hospital. But she ended up going like 10 days past the due date. So it ended up not being a big deal at all. But that was my last official triathlon that I did. But so did the Music City Triathlon. 2 weeks later, my daughter was born. And then a week after that, I broke my collarbone, totally like unrelated, just random, freak thing, broke my collarbone. So I didn't swim for, 2 months. I didn't ride my bike. I was quick to return to running. And once I was healthy enough, I did the Bell Ringer 25K.
Mm-hmm.
and just signed up for it on a whim about a week or two before that race. Didn't really train for it, and went out, and I was over an hour into the race before I even looked at my watch. And I was like, that's the most fun I'd ever had racing. And I was like, I've got to like look into it. And so from there, talked to some friends, found that the Yamacraw 50K was only about 30 or 40 minutes from where I grew up in Kentucky. So signed up for my first 50K, and then just was hooked from there on the ultra stuff. Once I finished that Yamacraw 50K, I did the deep dive into the YouTube ultra trail running, like watched all these videos about Western States and UTMB and all the cool stories. And, it's like, oh, who's Jim Walmsley and all these things. So like had a blast doing all that.
Yeah, and I mean, just looking at it, I mean, and I guess your fitness from the triathlons kind of came over immediately, because looking at how you did at Bell Ringer and Yamacraw, I mean, you were what, top five at Bell Ringer, Yamacraw, you were what, I think top three there. So I guess you still had your fitness from the triathlons, and that just moved right over into the running. I guess that's pretty accurate, right?
Yes. And like I went into that 25K. I had raced some of those guys before at other like road events. And so I went out fast with them, but I knew that like I had only been running, maybe 20 or 30 miles a week at the time, where that's a little lower mileage than what I'm used to. And so I went out with them, and then paid for it over the second half. Once you get on that windy section, I don't know if you've ever done Bell Ringer, but you end up on some mountain bike trails, and there's a lot
Hmm.
of twisty, turny trails, which is kind of hard to get in a good rhythm. So paid for it on the back half, but still, like you said, like I had a blast and was able to still finish top five. And then at Yamacraw, I went into it super nervous, but there were a couple guys that took off hard from the gun, and I just made sure that I was running at a pace that I felt that I could sustain I was like, okay, if I can break 5 hours, or in like, not that I had a time goal, I just wanted to make it to the finish and have fun at the same time. And I think I made it to about 3.5 hours before the wheels started. It warmed up. It was one of those days that it was hard to dress for. It was 30 degrees at the start, and I think it was supposed to get up to 70 by the time that, like lunchtime. And so like you start in, gloves and hat and long sleeves, and about 3 hours in, you're like, okay, where do I just throw my gloves off, at this next aid station? And so I went and didn't have a crew or anything. Just you're able to check a bag and grab some nutrition. But I had a blast. I do remember that last hour of Yamacraw, my watch had lost GPS, and so you're just kind of guessing where you were. Like, oh, I could be at mile 26, I could be at 29. Like I don't, and you're kind of you've got that brain fog. You're not sure
Hmm.
how fast I was like, I might be running 8-minute miles. I might be running 13-minute miles. I don't know how fast I'm going, So, and then finally, like I got close enough to the end that I heard the cheers, and you're like, okay, I think I'm pretty close. I hear people talking, and I hear people cheering. So
So yeah, and Yamacraw was my first 50K. Obviously, I'm not at your level, so I didn't place like in the top three or anything. And when I ran it, the weather was horrendous. We had snow and ice, and it snowed on us, it sleeted on us, and that was the year that they put the rafts across the water that you had to
yeah,
jump across. Um, and so, man, and that's a for for a first 50K, that course I felt like was pretty challenging, at least for me. I only ran some, like some, like I ran like down in Alabama and out in Memphis on some trails, and I had not got to experience anything like Yamacraw, but the course is gorgeous, I felt like, and I felt like it was a good challenge, and I really enjoyed it. Matter of fact, I'm thinking about trying to get out there again and running it and trying to get a faster time, since the first time I did it, I blew myself up and ended up like walking the last like 5 miles because I overcompensated, not knowing what I was doing in the ultra world. So,
I
but
think
that's a great course.
I'll say, and I
Um,
think that original course, there's some big hills right there around miles like 16 to 20, that
yes.
if you like don't respect those, then it can blow up that last third of your race.
That's me right here. Yeah, yeah. Because I ran that OG course.
Yep.
And then I think they ended up changing it just afterwards, which um, even though I blew up, it was literally one of the most fun I've ever had at a race, because it was just a beautiful course, and the race director is fantastic. The aid stations were great. It just was one of those races that just ticks off all the boxes for you. You just tick off like what the perfect race looks like, and the Yamacraw race is fantastic. So I guess, coming out of Yamacraw, I guess you started, realized, hey, I'm pretty good at this ultra game. And so, what was your thought process then? Were you just going to continue dipping your toes into different races and seeing how you're doing, and just upping your game from distances? Is that what your thought process was?
So being naive was, I watched all those YouTube videos that I talked about and learned about the golden ticket races. And I learned that the Georgia Death Race was a golden ticket race. And so that summer I entered the lottery for the Georgia Death Race, and fortunately got in. And at the time, like, I was literally in the state of Colorado on like a vacation, and we had a 1 year, my daughter was 1 at the time, and my wife would sleep in, let my daughter sleep in. I'd sneak out early in the morning and go like do a 2-hour trail run every morning, and learned that I got into the GDR race. And I was like, oh, like, this is perfect. I'm in Colorado. And now this is, August of 2017 or whatever. So I think I did one more 50K that fall, not knowing what I was getting into. It was a first year event. It looked like, on paper, just looking at the profile, it looked flat. And I was like, oh, I'll just go blaze it. And it ended up being one of those 50Ks where you kind of make your own path through it. So instead of running like, I thought that I'd go out and just run like 7-minute pace for the whole thing. I was running like 13-minute miles because I'm, weed whacking my way through these bushes and trees and everything else. But I did do the New York City Marathon that fall, and then took a little break before I dove into my training for the Georgia Death Race. And in the process of the Georgia Death Race, found a couple of local 50Ks, such like Mountain Mist and the Music City Ultra 50K, and built those into the plan just so that I was got used to, being on my feet for a long amount of time, finding some climbs, and also getting my nutrition plan down, because I'd never done anything like that before. So I wasn't sure what I was getting into with training for the Georgia Death Race.
And I mean, you crushed. Mountain Mist. Let me guess, David Riddle beat you.
David, yeah. How did you guess?
I don't even know why they even call it Mountain Mist. They should just call it the David Riddle Invitational.
That's right.
Because the guy wins it every year. This year he was slower this year and still won. He was like, I just got it done. And I was like, dude, come on. But you hung 4:15 at Mountain Mist, which is like, wow, that's huge. And then you went to the Music City Trail Ultra and won it. And so you had to be feeling pretty good about where you were, probably going into that training and getting ready for because you did, wait, hold on a second, you did the Music City Trail Ultra right before GDR, it looks like.
I did, yeah. That was
like 2 weeks before.
That was my last big, like, in my head, I was like, oh, that'll be my last big long run, and then I'll start my taper from there. And in the end, like, it probably wasn't the most ideal thing, but like, I coached myself, so I like to have fun with my training. And I made sure that I totally didn't, blow out my legs that week. Because I think the week of the Music City Trail Ultra, I went out to Percy Warner and I did 2 red, white, and blues that like 3 or 4 days before that Music City trail race. So I had a huge week of training, and then basically did like a 14 taper into the Georgia Death Race.
So you had to be feeling pretty good going into GDR, right?
I was really excited, and like I said, like, I was naive enough. I didn't know a ton of the names that were on the start list. And of course, like not everybody was on Strava. Like I did my best, like, oh, who's this guy? Like I'll look at a Strava and who's this guy? And of course the oh, I'm blanking on his name. The kid that won Western States the year that Jim Walmsley took the wrong turn. Andrew. But
Wait,
so he won Georgia Death Race. Like he was like
I got you.
the heavy favorite. And he crushed everybody. And I remember like going up the first climb, he had to stop for something, literally stop for over a minute, and then just came by us like we were standing still while, before we even made it up to like that first aid station, like the 8 mile mark into the Georgia Death Race. I was like, well, I'm gonna let him go. I'm not, gonna pace myself off of him. I've still got 70 miles to go or 68 miles to go.
So, I've never ran GDR, but I guess what were your thoughts of that race? I mean, is it as hard as everybody makes it out to be?
It was pretty challenging. I think Percy Warner, like the park that we have here in Nashville, I'm sure that you've been on those trails.
Oh yeah.
It does a really good job of preparing yourself for that race in the sense that the hills are very like straight up and down. The one thing that I didn't do enough of was just long, continuous climbs and the downhills. There were some long downhills on the Georgia Death Race course that I just wasn't prepared for. Like the downhills just blew my legs out. And I was trying to keep up with those faster guys early in the race by bombing the downhills. And I think that's ultimately like what did me in. Because I think once you get to about halfway or close to halfway at the Georgia Death Race, you get on more of a dirt road type trail. And so it's way more runnable. And there's even like a 4 or 5 mile section that you're on a paved road. And so if you've got legs, you can actually run fast. But by that time, I had totally blown out my legs and I was just already in survival mode and still had, 20 plus miles to go.
I mean, still you crushed it there. So I mean, and I guess, let me kind of intercede a little bit. You talked about training. Um, how did you approach training? And I know, you now do coaching as well. So how did you learn how to build your training blocks? I mean, was there a specific system that you went through to like to learn things, or was it just something that you kind of self-taught and developed your own system with?
So in terms of my trail running, I kind of would experiment on myself. And then, I started coaching a few friends at first in terms of trail running. And when they had success, that's kind of when I branched out a little bit more. And right now, like I'm probably about 50% triathletes and 50% runners of the people that I actually work with right now. But when I was coaching myself, I'd go out and I saw that those guys that were really good at trail running, they were just hitting the trails every day. And of course, like with my schedule, I couldn't do that every day, but I have some flexibility in my schedule that I would try and at least 3 days a week get out to Percy and just doing as much vert as I could while just, kind of working on the time on your feet. And like some days being more intentional about running fast or doing some sort of intervals or hill intervals. And then other days just focus like, hey, I need to get 4 hours in, incorporating some hike breaks. Cause like when you're approaching a 75-mile trail run, like you're going to do lots of hiking. And so just making sure that I was doing more of that and just making sure that those muscles were used to that. Because, walking and hiking are totally different than running. You're using different muscles. And for the Georgia Death Race specifically, we've got a treadmill. And I'd put my treadmill on 15% and just do some, maybe twice a week, just at least for 30 minutes, just hike at 15% and just kind of get used to walking uphill and build some strength that way.
So yeah, and it's funny because I just got finished interviewing Ryan Anderson, and I was talking to him about his philosophy on coaching, and I know that a lot of coaches have moved to this. Are you more of a time on your feet type of coach, where when you're coaching your folks, or even for yourself, do you focus on going out and doing a timed workout per se, instead of like a mileage type of goal? Like for example, if you're training for a 100 miler, you're going to go out and do a 3 hour run instead of going out and doing like a 20-mile run or something like that. Is that kind of the approach you have as well?
Most of the time, once we get closer to the event, like let's say that we're within like the last like 12 weeks of building up to, a 100K or 100 miler, I will specifically write in a mileage run just so hey, I want you to go 30 miles today, and and make sure that I mark it on the calendar 2 weeks out so that they know like, hey, we're going to go do at least a 50K in 2 weeks time. But for the other runs, like hey, go out for 3 hours, get as much vertical gain in as you can, work on and stick to that run walk ratio that we talked about, or hike the hills, run the flats and the downhills, or things like that, and give them specific things to work on going into those longer runs. So I do like to mix it up, but most of the time I'm going to give them time versus a mileage, because everybody has different access to different kinds of trails. If you're going out and running a flat trail, it might be 6 miles and 1 hour might be same thing. But if you're doing a super hilly run, and like let's say you're doing the Red Loop at Percy, that's that might be 4 miles in 1 hour.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So like you're looking at an extra 30 minutes if you're moving at 15-minute per mile as opposed to 10-minute per mile. So
I gotcha. That makes sense. And I think that's one thing that I have learned a lot from just talking with different coaches and different people. A friend of mine, he was being coached by Aaron Sapp, and a lot of the things that you just said, and some things that Ryan said were very similar to the same concepts that Aaron Sapp was telling my friend who John, who was training underneath him.
mm-hmm.
And so it's an interesting concept, one that for a recreational ultra runner like myself, I never thought about that until I heard it. And then once I started hearing it from multiple people, it made sense to focus on more of a time amount of, a time instead of going out and focusing on miles. Because I guess when you focus on miles, it's not the same as focusing on time, because when you're running these ultra events, you're really looking at, being on your feet for a certain amount of times, and you have to kind of build your body up to being on your feet through that time level. And like you said, the miles may look different from course to course. And so that makes like tons of sense.
Because it all depends on who you're working with too. If I tell one person to go do a 20-mile run, it might be 2 hours. Obviously, like it's probably not a trail run, that's going to be a road run. But like if it's somebody else, like that 20 miles might take them 5 hours. And like, who has time to go out every weekend for a 5-hour run? And like, how long is it going to take you to recover from that 5-hour run? So like, those are the things you kind of have to take into consideration when you're working with different individuals.
So when was it did you decide you wanted to do the coaching thing?
So when I was racing professionally in triathlon, my coach was starting her own coaching business.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to me and she said, hey, like, I've got too many athletes. Would you be interested in coaching? So we sat down, we talked about it. And so I got my USA Triathlon coaching certification back in 2011. So that's when I first got into coaching, but I didn't really grow it into a business until probably the last 4 or 5 years. I was coaching 5 to 6 people, mostly triathletes. And from there, it was mainly just kind of like helping friends, like, hey, Tony, like, I know that you do some coaching. I'm going to do the Chattanooga 70.3, or I'm going to do the Memphis 70.3. And so I would like, yeah, here, let me help you out, and we'll get those goals knocked out. But it was when I got into trail running that I had a few people reach out like, hey, like, I need help training for this 50K, or I need help for training for a marathon. And so right now, like I said earlier, like I've got half triathletes, and then I've half of my runners are either training for a marathon this spring, or the other half are looking at a 50K or a 50 or a 100K.
I got you. So the other thing, I guess, with the coaching as well is it really, like, you have to have time for, to do all that. Do you feel like that you're able to balance that pretty well? I mean, I know Ryan was telling me that he moved to doing it full time and was talking about, learning how to balance the time with it and learning exactly, how much to devote and how much not to devote. Was that a challenge for you, learning, how much time to kind of devote to people and not kind of overdo it?
Absolutely. So when I only had a handful of clients, I almost like devoted too much time. And they'd be like, Tony, like, you don't need to check in after every single easy workout. Like I'm doing all right. And so like, I've kind of learned from there that which athletes need a little more attention and which ones are a little more hands off. And what's funny is like some of them that are training for the more complicated races, they're the ones that are like hands off. And we'll talk or text or email like once a week and just kind of make sure that the issue that I'm running to, especially the last like 6 weeks, half of my athletes have had COVID at some point.
Mm.
And so we've had to work that, like one guy didn't even tell me that he had it. His workouts were just a little bit slower. And I was like, hey, like, is everything going okay? He's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I had COVID earlier in the week, but I'm fine. Like, just keep giving me workouts. I'm like, you sure? Where like, one other guy, like he basically had to take 2 weeks off. So it's just how it affects everybody and how we move forward. So one guy told me this just today that tomorrow we're like we after 2 weeks off, like, all right, we're going to do some easy stuff this week, but knowing that, hey, cut it short if you feel out of breath, or if you feel fine, like go for a little bit longer as long as that effort's easy.
Well,
And so kind
absolutely.
of learning from there, like which ways that we're going to approach these things.
Yeah, I would imagine that's tough. I would know I was talking with Grady Wills last night, and he was talking. I don't know if you know Grady, but he's a teacher, professor, and he was talking about how he was really how school has been a challenge for him because he's constantly having to deal with students being out with COVID and trying to balance, the schedule with the kids being out with COVID and teaching at the same time is challenging. So I would imagine coaching has to be the same thing, especially if you have like a race coming up, and most people, for the most part, are at least knocked out for a few days with it. So I would imagine it would at least knock most folks out for a few days, unless, you get an asymptomatic or a very mild version of it and you're able to
Right.
push right through it. So yeah, so I mean, I would imagine that has to be a challenge, very much so. So, and moving on and jump into a couple of different things. I don't want to miss out on some of these things that I've made some notes on. Um, you did 100 miler in Nashville, is that right? Like you ran around and got 100 miles. Tell me a little bit about that. That's really cool what you did there.
So that was kind of on a whim. It was inspired by David Kilgore, I think his name is.
Hmm.
I think he works for On, the shoe company, but he had done something in Florida where he ran a 100 miler and raised some money and then donated that money. And once the pandemic hit, I was training for a marathon. I was probably running 80, 90 miles a week. I hadn't done any 100 miler specific stuff. My longest run was maybe 23 miles. But then when the pandemic canceled everything, there's several, really good ultra runners here in town. And I had a buddy, he's like, hey, I'm going to go out for a 30-mile run. Like, you want to come join? I was like, sure, why not? So ran with him. And that was probably like middle of March. And I sat down with my wife and I was like, hey, like everything's canceled. I want to do something to help support the community. And at that time, that was right when the tornadoes had hit Nashville. And
Hmm.
so early March, the tornadoes hit Nashville, and then the pandemic hit like 2 weeks later. And so I have a friend that works at the food bank here, the Middle Tennessee Second Harvest Food Bank.
Yes, yes, Second Harvest Food Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So connected with them, set up a fundraising page, and then basically just tried to put it out everywhere on social media, and literally just walked out I set a date, looked at the weather, kind of like two weeks out, picked a random Saturday. I was like, all right, like this Saturday in April, I'm going to go run 100 miles around Nashville. I had a couple friends that live over in East Nashville that set up aid stations for me at their house. I went in, like, used their bathroom if I had to. And kind of once I got to about, my plan was to do most of the first half over in East Nashville to kind of work my way back towards my house. I live close-ish to Vanderbilt. And then kind of from there do some smaller loops and have an aid station set up in my front yard so that I could, loop back to my house every 6, 7, 8 miles, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
So through that, basically took off, got everything set up, and then all I had to do was go run. So woke up early on Saturday morning. I think I left my house at 5 a.m. and knocked out the first 50 miles or so was over in East Nashville, ran by several different friends' house that had aid stations set up for me. I was very fortunate. I did run with my phone. I don't normally run with my phone, but I was coordinating with about 8 different people who all wanted to run with me. And so I'd like text them, be like, hey, be at your house in, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it was, connect with them. And then I had one girl ran with me the first 20 miles. And then from there met up with another 3 or 4 friends over in East Nashville, and they ran 20 plus miles with me. From there, I ran home. By the time I made it home, I was at about mile 60, and got aid station that my wife had set up for me in the front yard. And from there, I did 5 8-mile loops. And the only not feedback, but the negativity, the only negative things that I had hitting me was it was right when everybody was weird about social distancing and if not, you shouldn't wear a mask. And so I had people yelling at me on the greenway, wear a mask or, get away from me. So that was the only weird part. But again, this is April of 2020. So we were less than a month into the pandemic and we didn't really know what was going on. But
right. Absolutely.
That, just kind of, I started at 5 a.m. I finished right around 9 p.m. So I told my wife, I don't mind running super long as I still get to sleep. It's the sleep deprivation that really gets to me. So anybody asks me that if I have any interest in the Barclays Marathon or, any race like that, I'm like, no, that cuts into my sleep. I need to sleep in my bed.
Right. And you're one of those guys that's so fast, you're not going to have to worry about missing time to go to sleep because you're done when most people aren't even when most people are maybe 2/3 of the way through it or something like that. So so for you ain't gonna worry about that. I remember when I ran the Yeti 100, Patrick Reagan was running it, and that guy finished in 12 or 13 hours. It was I think it was maybe 13 hours. It was some crazy fast time, and I was I can't even fathom how fast that is. It's just crazy. And then I was at Tunnel Hill when Zach Bitter broke the 100-mile record out there.
Yeah.
And it looked like that guy was just floating in the air the entire time. I was just I can't even imagine that. It was just nuts. But that is
the 50 miles that year.
You were there too? So you were there that really cold year then, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that was rough on me. I got hypothermia there. But I finished, but it was crazy cold. So
that's hard to dress for when the weather's like that.
Yeah, and that was that the year that you ran the 50 in under 6 hours?
I was just over 6 hours.
Just over 6 hours, but you ran under 6 hours there before though, right?
So I did 2 years in a row. That first year was the year that Zach Bitter was there. And of course, in my head, I was like, this guy's running 100. Surely I can run 50 with him. The answer was no, I could not do that. And I think I paced it perfectly. I just didn't eat enough. And by the time I made it to 35 or 40, I slowed down enough. I was to break 6 hours for 50 miles, you have to run 7:12 pace. And I ran 7:05 to 7:10 pace through about 35. And then it was 7:30s and then 7:45s. And I slowly just kind of gave away just enough time that, and the Tunnel Hill course, that last 10 miles, if you can make it there, it's downhill, or at least the last 8. But by then that was, my last 8 was my slowest, even though it was downhill, but I still managed. I think I ran 6:02 or 6:03.
Yeah.
But I think I made it I was like, oh, I'm coming back next year. I've got to break 6 hours. And I was way fitter the next year, and I was way more ambitious. Like by the time I got there, I was convinced I could run 5.5 hours. So I tried to go, I was on 6:36 pace through 30, and then really paid it back in those last 20 miles. But I still broke 6 hours, but just barely. I was running, 8:45 pace for that last 5 or 6 miles.
That's a stout time, and that course is, that's the crazy thing about these flat courses. It's funny because I, was talking with Greg Armstrong, and he was talking about how a lot of people consider these flat courses being super easy. But he said the thing with these flat courses that you have to watch out about is the fact that they are flat and your muscles get caught in the same repetition of doing the same thing over again, unlike a mountain course where certain muscles get a break because you're using different ones to go climb this hill or to go down this hill. And he said, but with a flat course like Tunnel Hill or even like the Yeti, he said, you're just using the same muscles over and over again. And he was talking about how, people blow up so much on these flat courses, getting ambitious, not realizing the toll that it takes on your body, even
Oh
though
yeah.
it's flat.
Yeah, and actually, so that first year I ran Tunnel Hill, I think I had a mandatory 3 weeks off after the race because I did something to my hip right before the race, and it was just like a little running injury that popped up, and it was too close to the race to like take any, to worry about it. I was like, my fitness is there. I'm going to take a little bit of ibuprofen before the race. But then once I got into the race, that race, I like really paid for it at the end. I finished the race, had a great race, but then 3 weeks completely off because of that injury. So, but it allowed the body to recover, and all was good. But yeah, like you were saying, it was just, I think if it were more up and down, I wouldn't have put that much damage on my hip.
Sure, absolutely. So you had some stout times there at Tunnel Hill, and then one thing I noticed a lot looking at posts that you make is you really talk a lot about marathon and marathon times. Um, any particular reason why you're shooting for those lower times?
So I've got a couple buddies here that ran in the Olympic trials in 2020.
Hmm.
And I think that last training cycle going in, I think that was Tunnel Hill of 2019 that I last ran Tunnel Hill. I did a lot of their long runs with them. And then once we got to, I think, so the race was early November. Once we got to about October, I was doing more 50-mile specific stuff, just like longer, like strength-based long runs. And they were starting their marathon specific stuff. So they're still doing 20 milers, but they're doing those 20 milers in, an hour and 55 minutes or whatever it is. Like, so these guys are, they're trying to break 2 hours and 19 minutes for the marathon to qualify for trials. And then to see both of them go and do that, I was like, and it put the thought in my head. I'm like, well, like I did a lot of those runs with them, like early on. Could I do that? And so that's kind of where I was. And at the time, like my PB was only, 242, but I'd never really like tried to run a flat and fast marathon. I've always done races like the New York City Marathon or a trail marathon or, something like that. I'd never like picked one that was supposed to be blazing fast.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of what my goal was that spring of 2020 before everything got canceled. And I ended up just doing a 100 miler instead of a fast marathon. But
so so I guess I didn't mean to interrupt you. So like so like from a goal standpoint, is that something you're still focusing on, or like what's your thought process with that?
yeah, very much so. So the Olympic trials are 2014. So I've got a couple years to kind of focus on that. And this past year, I was able to, I ran a 2:28 marathon at the Carmel Marathon last April, and did so with like the last 10K of the race being my fastest 10K of the race. And so I crossed the finish line. I was like, I think there's more in the tank. It was one of those, it was big enough to have a good crowd to start with. But by the end, I ran the last half marathon by myself. And I was like, if I were in a group of people, I think I could have run, a minute, maybe 2 minutes faster. And so I sought out the Monumental Marathon in Indianapolis this past fall, and I went into it pretty fit and knowing that they have a ton of fast guys there. And so I tucked in and went for it. My original goal was 225. And then after about 8 or 10 miles, I was on 224 low pace. And I was like, this feels comfortable. This is good. And then, as many people know, that what's comfortable at 10 miles isn't necessarily comfortable at 16 or 17 or 18 miles of a marathon. I got to about 16. And I was like, I'm slowing down just like 3 or 4 seconds per mile. And I'm putting a little more effort into these miles. And I got to about, I want to say 22, and the wheels just completely, unraveled. And I kept like doing math in my head. I'm like, okay, if I can run this pace for the next 4 miles, I'll be at this time. And it eventually got to the point that I was like, Tony, just make it to the finish. It doesn't matter what that time is. So I ran a 2:31, I think it was, at Indianapolis, but I went through the half at 1:12, like 10, which just a couple years ago was actually, so early 2021, that was my half marathon PB. I'd run like 1:12.0 something. And so for my first half at the Monumental Marathon, I ran 1:12, let's say 20. And so I was like, all right, I'm still sub 225 pace. I was like, I know I'm going to slow down a little bit, but I think I can still, at least break 227. And then once I got to 22, it was just like, okay, make it to the finish. Your wife's out there running too. Like, you can cross the finish and then jog back and find her and cheer her on. But I knew going into the race, I was like, I'm going to swing for the fences and hope I hit a home run. And unfortunately, I hit into a double play or, whatever. But there's more marathons out there. One bad race is at the end of the world. So.
That's right. So what was your time at the middle half when you ran it?
I ran 1:11. Like 1:11.15 maybe. It was somewhere, it wasn't like going into it, I had run 1:10 in the spring and I knew that I was about the same fitness, but middle half, like there was one guy that just took off from the very start. And I was like, all right, if I go out with him, I'm going to pay for it over the second half. So I kind of ended up in no man's land and ran the race by myself. I was in third place basically from a quarter mile into the race all the way to the finish. The two guys in front of me were never really that close, and I never really saw fourth place except for like at maybe the two 180-degree turns that we had. And so I just kind of was out there basically doing a time trial. And it's hard to really dig deep when you're running a race by yourself compared to the race that I ran in the spring, the Ashland City Half Marathon. There was a perfect group of guys that all kind of were running just a little bit faster than I probably should have been. And I didn't look at my watch. I did my best to turn my brain off and let them pull me along, and ended up running a 1:10.0 half marathon, which was my personal best.
That's amazing. Yeah, and that's the problem with the middle half. I usually pace at that race. So I'm one of the pacers, and what I've noticed is usually you have like one or two guys, and usually they're track guys from one of the local schools. Either it's somebody from MTSU or Vanderbilt, or somebody comes in from like East Tennessee, and they just blaze the hell out of that course. And it seems like because I always you always pass the lead group. Especially when you're pacing. And so you see them quite a bit. And so I always notice with that race, as flat and fast as it is, that there's usually a decent gap between the first couple of runners and the, third through fifth.
Right.
And it's usually, like you said, there's usually people running in no man's land. And I would think, to your point, to qualify for something of the magnitude that you're wanting to qualify for, you would have to have somebody pushing you or driving you to get to the finish line. Because like you said, when you're running by yourself, let's face it, we tend to get, I don't want to say we get lazy, but we tend to like just, there's nobody with us, right? We ain't
Yeah,
got to
that's right.
race anybody. We're chilling, right?
Yeah.
I'm just like, nobody there, it's just, let off the gas a little bit. So so I guess long-term goals, I mean, short-term, long-term goals, short-term goals, would that be, would you consider a short-term goal, or would you consider that a long-term goal for yourself?
I'll say long term in the sense that like I feel like I've still got 2 more years. It is a very big reaching goal. Like I know that it's a long shot, but so my wife and I are both signed up for the Boston Marathon. I've never been to Boston. We're
That's
gonna go.
exciting.
And she qualified, so we made the decision like, hey, the in-laws are going to come in, stay with the kids for the weekend while we go up for a long weekend in Boston. We're going to run the marathon. Hope to run fast, but also like want to take it in. So I'm going to train hard for it. I'm going to go try to run fast, but I'm not gonna try to go run 2:19 at Boston. I know how hard the course is and how bad the weather can be some years. And then in the fall, reassess, kind of find a fast marathon, and then put in a good block for that.
Are you pretty much going to lean away from, like, say, the ultra scene and the trail scene while you get ready for that? Is that kind of what you do when you are preparing for something like this?
I did learn like in 2018 and 2019, I get FOMO a lot. And so I would jump in a local half marathon or like another like road race while training for the Georgia Death Race or while training for this other trail 50K or Tunnel Hill. And I found that you can't be fit for a 50-mile trail race and a local 10K road race at the same time. Like those are two totally different kinds of fitness. And I was dealing with some minor injuries as a result of trying to, do speed work on the track and do all this climbing and on the trails and, lock into, 50-mile race pace, like things like that. So I am a little more road focused at the time. I wanted to do Mountain Mist both these past 2 years, but I got COVID at Christmas in 2020. And so and felt pretty crummy and basically took 2 weeks off. And that was, just less than 3 weeks out before Mountain Mist. So I made the decision. I was like, I guess I'm not going to do Mountain Mist this year. I'll do it next year. And then again, this year at, right around Christmas, I don't think it was COVID. I had something, but ended up taking 4 or 5 days off and dealing with a little bit of plantar fasciitis, like just enough that I wasn't able to get out and run every day. And I think, fingers crossed, I'm getting it under control now, but doing a lot of strengthening and stretching, and just have to be careful about like what surfaces I'm running. And unfortunately, going fast down hills is what aggravates it the most. And of course, going out and doing a mountainous trail race is probably not the best idea for that.
Yeah,
So
and
to
Nick,
answer your question, I wanted to do Mountain Mist the past 2 years because that fits perfect kind of into like the off season, and just had unfortunate health stuff pop up that made me make a smart decision. That it probably if it would have been 5 or 6 years ago, I would have jumped in it anyways just to see what happened. But
yeah, and this year it was exciting because it was like 16 degrees outside, and there was like the trails had like ice all over them. So but David Riddle still won and ran like in 4 hours and some change, so it didn't really matter for him. But so so and I think you hit it pretty well, talking about knowing the course and knowing where to do things, because even like a marathon like marathon the Nashville marathon's kind of hilly too. A lot more hillier than most people would think it would be. At least the
oh,
year
for
that,
sure.
I mean, I've ran it one year, and I remember thinking I didn't realize Nashville had so many hills running through this thing.
But the race director does a pretty good job of finding all of those hills.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say I think you probably have ran them all multiple times, so you're a professional at it. So
It still doesn't make
so
them fun at the points in which the race that you hit those hills, though. They did
no, no,
change the
no.
course a little bit this past year. So I heard in previous years you had a huge hill over by the golf course in East Nashville, They did cut that one out of the race this past year, but they hit still. You made a loop around that pond over close to Shelby Bottoms.
Mm-hmm.
And I joked with somebody that I always thought of that as flat until you're running that at mile 20 of a marathon. Like, oh, this is like a gentle climb, like rolling hills over here that I never noticed until mile 21 of a marathon.
Yeah, the year I ran it was the year that they had to end it early because the heat was so bad.
Oh, yeah.
I still finished, thank God, before they ended the race. But I mean, a guy passed out in front of me at like mile 20, like right at the pond, literally. And
Oh,
I
God.
was thinking, how crappy is that for your race to end like that close to the finish line?
Yeah.
I mean, this is just awful. So I guess I already asked you your goal. So I guess that's your main goal, is hitting that qualifying time, and it sounds like you have a solid plan to do it. So that's really exciting. I definitely hope you get it, and it seems like you have a solid plan to do so. Just listening to you talk, I mean, I know it's extremely difficult to run at that speed. So I can't even fathom it, because I can't even get close to running at that speed. So, but anyway, I guess we'll wrap things up here at this point. I mean, man, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and talk about your run. And you've done so many great things, and like, the 100-mile around Nashville for the charity, that's just like huge, and doing it during such a hard time when people are, like you said, there's a lot of uncertainty and whatnot. And now more than ever, I guess, we realize the need that people need through COVID, especially 2 years into this thing.
Right.
It's like you can't do enough for people at this point in the game. So,
I'll say what was so cool about that was I shared, like, I think I set my initial goal at maybe $2,000 to raise for that charity. And after like a day or two of just telling friends about it, sharing a little bit on social media, we had already blown through that. I had to change the goal 3 different times just to get it. And I think we ended up raising almost $10,000 for the food bank. And that was something that, like, it was totally unexpected. When I first talked to them, I was like, yeah, I hope maybe we can raise at least $1,000. And they're like, oh, that would be so great. So to do 10 times that was awesome. So.
And I think one thing real quick to mention is the one thing that was missed in this is it's really fun to run around Nashville, even with the hills, when you're doing it recreationally.
That's right.
And you're not in a race, because like me and some friends did the the Jaggalope beer relay, where you run to all the different breweries around town.
Sure.
It's where you pretty much hop in a van, and somebody runs to this brewery, and then you hop in another van and you run, and you just kind of zigzag around town. And that was one of the most fun things, because I think each of us got to run 2 legs of it, and it was so much fun.
Oh,
And
yeah.
like, I mean, it's just like, getting to run around Nashville and, raising money for a good cause. I mean, that's just really cool. So, but again,
one thing that was special about it was, like, I was on Broadway at 5:30 a.m. Like, it's a totally different type of Broadway compared to like what most people experience. But being a runner, you can run straight down the middle of the street. All the lights are still on. It's quiet, and you're just seeing a totally different side of Nashville than most people see. So that's cool.
that definitely is. And I mean, and like I said, the bigger thing is just what you did, and like for the cause, and how many people can say they ran 100 miles around Nashville. I know Jason Thinnell can say he ran 100 miles at Percy Warner.
Yeah.
And,
That's definitely not on my bucket list.
Come on, you don't want to go out and get that FKT there from Jason?
I'll go after the one time red, white, and blue FKT. I don't know about the what is that 9 times that he had to do it to get 100.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard the story about it, but the first time he went to do it, he took his truck, and I think he got tired, and he realized that he could just get in his truck and go home. And so he like got in his truck and drove home the first time he attempted it. And then the second time he attempted it, he rode his bike out instead, because he knew that it would be much harder to quit and get on your bike and ride home.
That's right.
Then, but he still had to ride the bike home, which is nuts, to run 100 miles out there and then ride your bike to the house. I mean, that's just beyond me, but he's a hell of an athlete, so I mean, somebody like him, he can handle that load. So, but again, man, I appreciate it so much, talking to me, taking the time out of your Sunday to spend with me. It means a lot, and to talk about your running is phenomenal. So that's it for this week's episode. Like I was saying, I got more on deck for you. And if you haven't given the channel a subscribe, please do. As always, give us a like here, and it goes a long ways. And that's it. And I will see you on the trail. Thanks again, Tony.
Yeah, thank you.